must be a question. Okay, I'll ask you a question. I don't give you all time. I read an article in The Economist recently where they were pointing out that geologists were now recognizing that man's actions have become a geological force. It was a very interesting article because heretofore geologists who look at very deep time and long, very immortal time spans, basically, when you think about what man has produced, we think about in terms of maybe aesthetics, things that we can perceive, very connected to our lifespan, kind of mortality. So I was very interested in this kind of shift in geology, and suddenly things that we are doing and have done have now have taken on a geological scale to the point that they're now similar to other geological issues and consequences that that science has taken on. So do you see, and I know maybe this is thinking back to where you started with the Descartes, and we call it semi-natural open space, but it's the same thing as space left over at the planet. That there was a certain moment in the kind of trajectory of modernism and the kind of polemic of modernism when nature had a role, had a kind of a place, but it was a place within a different kind of set of preoccupations. I mean, very much about urbanism and about the city and the aesthetics of that and the culture of that and so on. And a lot of the way that, what I got, the message that came across very strongly tonight was the idea that, well, now the landscape has the same level of discourse that the city has had in modernism. So my question is, kind of within looking at this shift in the way that geologists are now thinking about man's actions, is there a comparable, let's say, event happening in terms of how we think about landscape? In other words, is there a level at which some of these the issues that you're raising are no longer corresponding to our day-to-day life, and no longer they have an impact, of course, and all that, but they also have, let's call it, immortal consequences which enter into a whole other kind of scale of change, which is maybe it's about climate change, I don't know, maybe it's about cultural change, maybe it's about economic change, I'm not really sure. But do you see that kind of a, let's say, what I would call, maybe within, I think it's fairly monumental to say that geologists suddenly consider man's actions to not be part of geology? Is there some discourse about landscape?
Well, I'll try and answer that. It's quite a complex question, so you can tell me if I've answered it. I think I haven't actually come across that article about our impacts on geology, but I have heard similar kinds of claims made. And if I can just sort of dwell on that, what we might mean by that for a moment. I mean, in a sense, the extent to which we are engineering the Earth's surface is a geological impact, if you like. And we've had this in a small way in the past, in that, if you like, during the Second World War, we actually found that a lot of the metal deposits in our cities, such as iron railings, became a natural resource, and obviously recycling aggregates from reclamation sites and so on, becoming a geological stratum in their own right, if you like. But if you think about the rate of human population growth, we were just about to hit 7 billion. And I was surprised actually when I looked through the timeline to realise that the world wasn't that much over 2 billion when I was born, so that's a pretty scary rate. And it's going to get to probably plateau at around 10 billion later this century, I think. If you think about the scale of megacities that that's going to mean, and the rural to urban migration that is occurring, then you can really see the geological impact of that. I mean, huge amounts of concrete, tarmac, etc. And we really do need to think in landscape terms about how we create that geological space. Otherwise our cities will become uninhabitable. And I think that's one of the reasons why I have shifted my interest from the country to the town. And my view of the landscape is now something that should be rich and multifunctional and connected right through from the urban centre, right through to the wild areas. It puts it into perspective. You know, one of your postgraduate master's Chinese students comes up to you and said, well, you know, I'm going to be graduating in a year's time. I've got to go back and design the green infrastructure for my city. Tell me how it's done. But you realise that's where it's happening. You know, the extent of urbanisation is going to be so great that we have to make these cities a working landscape. We have to consciously do it. They have to be somehow natural, multifunctional, resilient, adaptive, and all the rest of it. Certainly, you know, one of the sort of more teleological aspects, if you like, would be the whole idea of connections between people and places. What happens if these are lost? You know, the impacts on people of loss of greenery are quite striking when you look at the psychological and medical literature and what might become of us as a species.
Thanks, Mark. Great. Yeah, I'd just like to know a little bit more about your feelings on when you were talking about the sense of loss of connectivity to various things, loss of connection to nature and place and each other through those elements. Is there something about that we will eventually make a decision to be kind of post-nature, and we will kind of agree that we have new spaces and new models for interacting
with nature or with just other design space?
Yeah, well, I suppose I'm kind of thinking about the internet really as a landscape and how we connect to each other and relate with each other. And that landscape is immaterial, basically. It's not really a question, but
well,
with respect to that sense of loss.
Yeah. I mean, people have various views of the future, and I think it's very important not to prejudge what might be a good or a bad landscape. Some people can think that a good landscape will be an entirely virtual world. Some people would actually say that it would be good if we spent our lives in completely urbanic environments. We create more human spaces within those. And so I think it's a bit dangerous to prejudge what might be good or bad. There was another very interesting study sponsored by Natural England very recently, which ran some scenarios for the future. And those scenarios were very interesting. You know, they were kind of back to localism, back to keeping it local. Some were very high tech. You know, some of the technologies go to solve everything. And there were a range of different future scenarios. And there were some surprising outcomes. So we shouldn't just be essentialists and say, you know, green good, concrete bad. But there is some pretty compelling literature, just very broadly if you look at the biophilia stuff, some pretty compelling literature that actually we start to malfunction as a species when we are divorced from that kind of contact with quality nature, quality green space. And some people would attribute some of the dysfunctionality, some of the social dysfunction of cities to that loss of connection, that extinction of experience. So some of the literature surrounding that is pretty compelling, the sort of health, well-being, social psychology literature. So that's a very broad answer to the question. But equally, you know, I think it would be very naive to say, oh, it would be good if we all went back to nature and did permaculture and lived in little human-sized communities. It's worth reading those scenarios and seeing the unexpected outcomes.
Paul, as a practicing architect, I have more recently come to dilemmas about what is architecture, what is planning, are they relevant anymore? Is 3 dimensions enough? Are we not all designing environments at both the large scale, or we're conscious of environments at the large scale and the very small scale, and that we have to take temporality into account in terms of time. Maybe you've answered it with your postgraduate Chinese student going back to Sichuan, designing their green infrastructure or whatnot, but I'm curious about your impact or your sense of effect over your career on policy and the students that you've had. I presume you're talking about the Arts Tower, the architecture school with Drew and Jeremy and all those people. Do you have anything to say about, maybe comfort me with some sense of what architects maybe could do? I have a sense of what we should be doing, but I'm interested to hear what you think is the profession going forward.
Yeah, I suppose I've spoken about this concept in a very holistic way, but it's perfectly obvious that one person can't do everything, and that in order to make this work, you need specialists, you need people who work at different scales and bring different skills, who appreciate the bigger picture and who appreciate how they all fit together and work in a multidisciplinary team. But you need the people who work in different scales with different skill sets. Just almost an anecdotal answer, but I think it makes the point and it transfers. We were a department of landscape, not of landscape architecture, and that was quite a deliberate point, although almost all the students in it were trained to be professional landscape architects. But we called it the Department of Landscape because we wanted to break away from the narrow conception of design and say that landscape architecture is about something much bigger. And we sometimes used to have spats between the people who thought of themselves as real landscape architects, the designers, the three-dimensional people, and the rest of us. And my answer to that was that I think of myself as a designer. I think of all the people in the department as designers. I think of myself in terms of a Macardian sense of design with nature. But I tend to design at 2 dimensions. I tend to think in terms of, if you like, map form over large scales. Some of you, who call yourselves designers, work at 3 dimensions, and that's very important. And I've said that visuality isn't enough, but it is very important. It's the primary sense. It's very important for spaces to work in that 3-dimensional sense. And some of us in the department emphasise the 4th dimension, the landscape managers, the applied horticulture people, and they're very interested in how the landscape evolves over time, so then the 4th dimension becomes very important. So we're all in it together, the 2-dimensional, the 3-dimensional, the 4-dimensional people, but the 3-dimensional people don't have primacy, but it is very, very crucially important that things work in that human, perceivable sense of being in place.
I'd just like to return to what you're saying, the extension of experience you think people are having. Do you think, is that a projected hypothesis of the future, or is that happening now? Just thinking of your description of place earlier, and conversely non-places, sort of, is that like those places such as airports, motorways, whatever, do you think they are affecting people now, or is that just kind of a buzzword that...
Well, I think in those sorts of environments, they're fairly transient. I think the literature about it would relate more to, if you like, children growing up in very unremitting, harsh urban environments, having no contact with the countryside, with animals, with nature. So that's where most of the literature has focused. And there are a range of interesting studies about using sort of social psychological methods, profiling and so on, which you can use to say, yes, there's some truth in that. These children are going to grow up with attention deficit, less rich experiences, less able to handle different kinds of knowledge, less able at socialisation and that sort of thing. And that you can improve a lot of those deficits through structured contact with nature. And you can see nature and gardening and so on being used in therapy in various ways. So there's quite a lot of literature that says those, what the psychologists call discords in the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. There's quite a lot of good literature on that which kind of does give some evidence, some substance to these suppositions that sound reasonable suppositions, and some evidence to support that. But there are some interesting ideas, of course. People like Will Rogers have said, these motorways and motorway service stations and so on are the linear cities of the future, and that's where we ought to be emphasising design. And I've seen some very good examples of contact with nature in those, in the form of sustainable drainage schemes. So, yeah, this is important there as well. And of course, motorways have become very important biological corridors, so forth.
So is it a case then of these man-made systems acquiring kind of natural scale to the point that they suddenly become wrapped into nature in that kind of way? In other words, is it possible that design solutions along the lines of the ones you're talking about can achieve that level of, call it harmony or integration or whatever? Or are we on this planet that's spinning around the sun that's basically experienced dynamic change since it was created, and is this just another moment in that kind of process?
You've had doomsters throughout history. I think there's a fair case that we are actually, as a species, approaching a tipping point. Yesterday we were talking about things like water will be the new oil, and it certainly will be. The thought of the Earth carrying 10 billion people when around the middle of the last century had 2 billion, that's an incredible hammering for it to be taking. Can we kind of reinstate natural systems? So yeah, we could all be doomed. We might have a huge population collapse. We've got models that can predict that. We may be screwed. But then the human species tends to be optimistic and look for solutions. And there's some very, very interesting work on, if you like, bringing nature back into cities and just breaking down this artificial divide between town and country to reconnect the hydrological, ecological, airshed systems and so on that in between them. That study that I referred to in Greater Manchester by Gill and colleagues, very interesting stuff on the way that the city can be regreened and naturalised, with things like vertical gardens, green roofs, sustainable drainage schemes of various sorts, reintroducing urban wild and so on. Very, very interesting opportunities. In terms of do we need to kind of re-engineer the city, well, one of the things that came up in yesterday's session was a fascinating talk about Chicago and about the, if you like, putting sustainable measures back into urban design in some of the most hostile and unpromising parts of the city. And I think the key point there is that if you look at, I presume the housing stock here, certainly in the English case, I think that's fairly typical of Western Europe, the rate of the change in the urban stock is about 1% a year. So it's great we can get tabula rasa designs and say this is how we're designing the perfect eco-town to fit in with nature. But that's only about 1% of where we're living. 99% of the time you're retrofitting. And there's very, very interesting retrofit solutions now being proposed and starting to work. But it needs civil engineers and all the sundry to radically reappraise what they've been doing.